Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Winecast. So, this cast is just a brief one to hit a couple of points that I was having trouble fitting into my last cast on the Côte de Nuits, or that came up in viewer comments as needing clarification. I hope it doesn't feel too disjointed or jumpy, but hopefully there's some information floating around in here that you can do something useful with. So, let's keep it short and sweet and jump right in. Point 1, let's talk about the village of Flagey-et-Chazeau. But before we do that, let me give a shout out to my subscriber Wyatt Alexander, who wrote in with a question about this that prompted this point. Flagey-et-Chazeau is located between Vougeot and Vosne-Romanée, and it's really a screwball of a village, even by Burgundy standards, because although it has two Grand Cru vineyards, Etchazeau and Grands Etchazeau, and three Premier Cru and a number of village vineyards, there's no Flagey-et-Chazeau village appellation. So the Premier Cru and village-level vineyards that would normally get their appellations from this village have to get it from somewhere else, in this case, Vosne-Romanée, and they get folded into the vineyard count for that village. The Grand Cru vineyards are their own appellations, and they don't depend on the village for their respective status, so some certification curricula fold them into the count for Vosne-Romanée as well, but some count them as part of Flagey-et-Chazeau and bring the count for Vosne-Romanée down to 6 Grand Cru. How should you count them? Beats me. All I know is nothing in Burgundy is ever simple, and I'm beginning to think that's part of the charm. Point 2, let's talk about nuts. So hang around a group of wine people who are talking about Burgundy long enough, and someone's bound to mention, if only to keep the conversation going, that they heard somewhere that the Nuit in Côte de Nuits doesn't mean nights like you learned in high school French, but actually comes from the Latin word for nuts, specifically walnuts. Though by the time this comes up in conversation, everyone will have probably had a fair amount to drink and won't really care all that much. Is there any truth to this? Well, sort of. So let's go full Snopes.com on this one. As far as I can tell, this story enters the English-speaking wine world thanks to a passage in James Wilson's very good book Terroir from 1999, where he cites an earlier book by Pierre Forgeot, the 1967 Guide de l'Amateur de Bourgogne, or the Amateur's Guide to Burgundy, where Forgeot claims that the word nuit is derived from the Latin word for walnut that he gives as either nutium or nuetium. So what's the problem? Well, fun fact about me that you might not know, I used to be a Latin teacher, for 10 years in fact. Yep, straight up legit Latin teacher. Omnia Gallia divisa est in partes tres and all of that stuff. And I can't find either of these words anywhere. Not as words for anything, let alone for nuts, wall or otherwise. I get that Latin, especially when you factor in medieval Latin, has a huge vocabulary, so I might have missed something, but I don't think so. Nuit definitely doesn't come from the actual Latin word for nut, because that word, nux, with the stem form nucus, is missing the signature letter T in nuit. A more promising source might be from the Celts who lived in this area before the Romans and whose language has a reconstructed word for nut that I won't even try to pronounce, that has an element that might have morphed into a T sound over time. I'm out of my depth trying to evaluate that, but what I can say is, nuts yes, Latin no. Point 3. Is it the Golden Slope or the Eastern Slope? This one is a bit like the last one in that it's a bit of etymological trivia that you'll hear at parties or by your favorite wine snob. What's it all about? So, Côte d'Or isn't actually the name of the slope that all of those famous vineyards are on, but it's the name of the department or French administrative unit that contains it. And it's well known that that department got its name from the French parliamentarian and member of the Constituent Assembly of 1789, Charles-André Rémy Arnaud, and that Arnaud reportedly chose the name because the leaves on the trees that dotted the actual slope turned a beautiful golden color in the fall. Despite this, it's amazing how often you'll hear that the name of the slope or the department doesn't come from the golden leaves on the trees, but is actually an abbreviation, or apocope if you want to get really fancy, of the phrase Côte d'Orient, or Eastern Slope, presumably because the slope is east-facing after all. Any truth to this story? Well, probably not. Here's why. First, while French does abbreviate or apocopate words all the time, for example, you'll hear French people talk about riding a vélo instead of a velocipede or a bicycle. Or for Orient doesn't seem particularly likely to be one of those abbreviations. One, it hasn't entered the language generally, and when French people talk about going east, they don't usually or even ever say that they're going lor instead of l'Orient. 2, even though I spent the last 2 weeks looking up sources that writers making this claim referred to, I have yet to find an actual argument, as in presenting evidence, to back up the claim that that's what the name means. Every single source I looked at, and I looked at a fair number, just asserted that it was true and never offered any backup for it. Also, and here's another fun fact about me, between growing up a native Spanish speaker and taking both French and Latin in high school and graduate school, I ended up with a fairly solid reading competence in French, even though I'll be the first to admit that my pronunciation sucks hard sometimes. So I was able to check both French and English language sources about the origin of the name, and, interestingly, the only sources that say that Côte d'Or is short for Côte d'Orient are in English and not in French. In fact, all of the French ones are completely down with the idea that the name is all about golden leaves that are rustling in the fall wind, making me think that some English-speaking wine writer just made up the whole or is short for Orient thing, and then it got carelessly repeated down the line. And no, that wouldn't be the first time that that's happened in the wine world. Why would anyone make something like that up? Well, assuming it wasn't a straight-up lie, though I'm not ruling that out, it might be an honest mistake based on the fact that inhabitants of the Côte d'Or are known as either Costalouriens or as Côte d'Oriens, which sounds a lot like Côte d'Orient. But alas, the two are unrelated, with the IENS ending being a standard French ending to indicate where a person is from, just like people from Paris are called Parisiens. Listen, if I miss something or if anyone knows an actual argument with evidence for this, please let me know and I will happily eat my words. But as of right now, I'm calling this myth busted. So how about a bonus pour before we end? Here's a question. What's up with that little thing over the O in Côte that you see in a bunch of other French words? Well, that's a circumflex, and in French it can actually represent a few different things, but the most common one is that it identifies a missing S that used to be part of the word, but disappeared as French pronunciation changed over time. Knowing that can be helpful in making connections between French wine words and other vocabulary. So, for example, the word côte comes from the Latin word costa that means rib, or more broadly, side, as in the side of a hill. The Abbey of Citeaux, near Dijon in the Côte d'Or, was founded by the Cistercian monks, who were influential in developing the concept of terroir in Burgundy. And a little farther afield from Burgundy, chateau comes from the Latin word castrum, that means fort or encampment, and that would eventually make its way into English as castle, which is what chateau means literally in French today. Thanks for joining me for another Winecast. I hope this one tidied up some loose ends from the last cast and left you with something interesting that you didn't know before. If you found it enjoyable or helpful, please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and please always feel free to leave a comment, question, or request like the one that inspired part of this cast. I really, really love hearing from all of you guys. I'm your host, the Unknown Winecaster, and I'm out. Enjoy the grape, but always enjoy it responsibly.